The first two MCU movies of 2023 and of Phase 5 are both trilogy closers for franchises that began during the first two phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania and Guardians of the Galaxy Vol.3 adding the Ant-Man and Guardians franchises to the respectively long list of trilogies and quadrilogies that have come out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which for these two franchises specifically is no small feat considering how low tier these characters were before the MCU took a chance on them, turning them into big movie franchises and household names, although one of them definitely ended better than the other. With that in mind, while the MCU definitely does have a relatively consistent track record, or at least it did during the Infinity Saga, not every one of these trilogies is equal to each other, and with the only remaining franchises from the Infinity Saga, Doctor Strange and Captain Marvel, not becoming trilogies anytime soon, the recent release of Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3 is the perfect time to look at the 7 trilogies / quadrilogies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and rank them from worst to best. Now, none of these trilogies are these complete works that you could watch from start to finish and fully understand, in that they're all broken up with Avengers movies, or even a holiday special in the Guardians of the Galaxy's case, so you can't exactly judge them based on the completeness of their stories, given their place in a cinematic universe. What you can judge them on is the average quality of their movies, the effectiveness in which they use their cinematic universe to the benefit of their story, and the completeness of the arcs of the characters, or how they lead into the completeness of the arc if they end their arcs in Avengers movies. Basically, none of these are the typical trilogies, so we do have to look at them a bit differently. Also, for the sake of simplicity, I will not be including any non-movies like Falcon and the Winter Soldier or the Holiday Special into these franchises, just movies, nothing else. With that in mind, let's begin. Right at the bottom of the MCU trilogy ranking is not a trilogy, but in fact a quadrilogy with the Thor franchise, consisting of Thor, Thor the Dark World, Thor Ragnarok, and Thor Love and Thunder, beginning in 2011 and ending, at least for now, in 2022. The quadrilogy can be split into two eras, the first being far more forgettable, starting with a decent but relatively unmemorable origin story movie in Phase 1, which is definitely helped by having a great villain. Following that is The Dark World, which has always been the popular choice for the worst movie in the Infinity Saga, and it is hard to disagree. The Dark World manages to be less memorable than its predecessor due to its boring plot and uninteresting villain. There was a clear problem here, and as Chris Hemsworth has said in many interviews, they decided to reinvent the character of Thor, thus beginning the second era of the Thor movies, which can be completely defined by the director, Taika Waititi. Thor Ragnarok completely changed Thor into a lovable, funny character in a movie that's widely regarded as a hilarious, visually pleasing, effective reinvention of a side of the universe that wasn't quite working. I have personally always felt a bit of hollowness to Ragnarok in that every potential emotional moment in what should have been an emotional story was undercut with a joke, but hey, at least the movie was funny and at least it was memorable. Because of these things, Ragnarok is a not very high point, but a high point nonetheless for the Thor franchise. The follow-up, however, Love and Thunder, took all the good parts of Ragnarok and threw them in the garbage in exchange for an uptick in all of the movie's core issues. Love and Thunder is a joke of a movie that does not take its character, plot, or villain seriously. Thor is an idiot, the villain is completely underutilized, and the plot feels like more like a series of sketches strung together as an excuse to just tell jokes, and the worst part is that Thor Love and Thunder is simply not funny, which seems to be the general consensus. In the end, the Thor quadrilogy is a story of an uneven and uninteresting beginning leading to a largely successful reinvention that quickly falters by overcompensating for the initial disinterest. That being said, honestly the MCU is so great that even the worst franchise isn't necessarily bad, it's really just mediocre. A trilogy that came to a slightly more recent conclusion is the Ant-Man movies, consisting of Ant-Man, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and Quantumania. The Ant-Man trilogy began in 2015 and ended in 2023, and started off far better than it ended. In my opinion, the first Ant-Man movie is simply a blast. It's fantastic, one of the funniest, if not the single funniest movies in the MCU, which uses the concept of Ant-Man's unique shrinking powers more effectively than any of his subsequent appearances. A prevailing opinion is that what made this first Ant-Man movie so great is that it had a lot of elements left over from the vision of the original director Edgar Wright, and while I didn't always buy into that, after the next two Ant-Man movies, and also all of his appearances in the other Marvel movies, at this point I think I do buy into that. Ant-Man and the Wasp fails to recapture the comedic or visual heights of Ant-Man, but also feels like the single least important movie in the Infinity Saga, with only the end credits scene not really being filler. I mean, nothing else in the movie really matters, which is extra unfortunate given its placement between Infinity War and Endgame. On the flip side of that, Quantumania is extra important to its saga, which might be a part of its downfall, as the movie completely cuts out the supporting cast, with Luis being especially missed, in exchange for what is now Team Ant-Man being placed in the quantum realm in an admittedly really fun adventure with a good villain that is just filled with issues in the visuals, the pacing, the characters, and the complete lack of interesting use of Ant-Man's powers. I don't hate it, I like it more than Ant-Man and the Wasp because at least it's fun. But either way, neither film comes close to the quality of the first, which in and of itself is great, but not exactly S-tier Marvel, which really makes you wonder what an Ant-Man trilogy fully directed by Edgar Wright would have looked like. I like the first movie, but unfortunately, the next two definitely let it down. The first completed trilogy in the MCU, ending far before any other, is the Iron Man trilogy, consisting of Iron Man, Iron Man 2, and Iron Man 3. The trilogy began in 2008 and ended in 2013, which is kind of crazy to me. Iron Man 3 made $1 billion, and that was 10 years ago. 10 years later, we haven't had a single new Iron Man movie since. Obviously, he's now dead, but it's wild that Disney simply isn't doing anything with a $1 billion franchise, which, if I'm honest, is a shame because I've really turned around on this trilogy over the years, having come to appreciate it more and more. I used to hold the opinion that the first Iron Man movie is overrated, but upon my most recent rewatch, I found myself enjoying it more than ever. It's an incredible origin story and character arc for Tony, with visual effects that are still impressive to this day, and even surpass the Iron Man CGI of some more recent, higher budget movies, specifically like Infinity War. Iron Man 2 is definitely the low point of the trilogy, as there's just far too much going on, with a large focus being on a pretty terrible villain who very much wants his board. Iron Man 3 is definitely a movie I've enjoyed more and more over time. The fact that Tony isn't in a suit very much, as well as the Mandarin twist, are definitely valid complaints, but Iron Man 3 is a pretty fun movie regardless, with a unique take on a superhero who's suffering from extreme anxiety, and with the Mandarin twist being resolved later on in the universe, Iron Man 3 I feel has aged rather well, and the Iron Man trilogy in general is decent, nothing great or anything, but definitely what I would call decent. There is a clear cutoff point after this, as the next 4 franchises are all quite similar to each other in quality. Any of them could have been number 1 on this list. On my list, it was difficult to choose, and if you were to put any of them as number 1, I would not be able to disagree or argue against that, which just showcases some of the absolute best of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Out of the 7 trilogies / quadrilogies, 4 of them, which is over half, are pretty great, which is awesome. At number 4, however, is the Spider-Man Home trilogy, consisting of Spider-Man Homecoming, Far From Home, and No Way Home, beginning in 2017 and ending in 2021, making it the fastest MCU franchise to become a trilogy because, well, it's Spider-Man, it makes sense. Because this is Spider-Man, in deep contrast to something like the Guardians movies, or honestly the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there is this preconceived notion, and it's a very strong one, as to what Spider-Man should be, especially since this is the 3rd movie franchise about Spider-Man, and sure, I would have liked for them to mention and deal with the death of Uncle Ben or talk about him at all, and Far From Home definitely could have focused less on Iron Man, but I cannot understand the idea of these things ruining an otherwise fantastic trilogy of Spider-Man movies. Spider-Man Homecoming is a perfect balance of an enjoyable and funny high school movie with an intense and emotional Spider-Man movie with a fantastic villain and villain twist, which I just can't help but love. I mean, it's Spider-Man, as great as the MCU has been at taking lesser-known characters to the spotlight, and way lesser-known characters at that. Still, nothing really beats Spider-Man as a character. Far From Home does continue what would become a trend in this trilogy of having the absolute best villains in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with Mysterio's, let's call them, abilities, giving us some incredible visuals in a movie that, yes, does probably focus a bit too much on Iron Man, but at the same time also works very well as a part of Peter's arc throughout the trilogy, which a lot of people have said is becoming Spider-Man, and that's not really true. He is Spider-Man at the beginning. He has something similar to the responsibility line. However, I think his arc is about learning to become an independent and mature hero, which comes to a head in No Way Home, which is probably the only one of these movies that is almost universally loved. No Way Home is an absolute gem of a movie that simultaneously manages to complete Peter's arc in an emotionally satisfying way and serve up some of the best and most effectively handled fan service in the MCU, which connects together all of the Spider-Man franchises, mostly putting to bed the rivalries between their fans and the criticisms of the deviation from the preconceived notions of what it means to be Spider-Man. Plus, Green Goblin and also other villains are incredible. The Spider-Man Home Trilogy is a fantastic series of movies that shows the natural growth of Peter Parker, consistently has the best movies in the MCU, and like I said, nothing really beats Spider-Man, although that's as a character. As trilogies in the MCU goes, that's not exactly true, although like I said, if you put this trilogy at number 1, it would be difficult to disagree. Looking at the trilogies of the Infinity Saga's big three, there is such a clear standout with the Captain America movies, which is so much better than the Iron Man and Thor movies, as out of the 7 movies in those two franchises, only one is at the same level of the worst Captain America movie, as I would say Iron Man and Captain America the First Avenger are pretty much equal in quality, and the trilogy literally only gets better from there. Also consisting of Captain America the Winter Soldier and Captain America Civil War, the trilogy began in 2011 and ended in 2016, cementing itself as one of the best comic book trilogies of all time, starting off with a compelling World War II set origin story that captures the essence of the golden age of comics, followed by this clear switch in genres to this thrilling spy action movie, a scary and personal villain providing the emotional through line, and a Captain America that is so much more badass than ever before. Captain America the Winter Soldier cemented Cap as one of the cornerstones of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After the Avengers movies kind of made him a bit lame, it wasn't up until the Winter Soldier that Captain America was considered at the same level and as beloved as Iron Man. Finally, the trilogy changes directions yet again, turning into a full-on Avengers movie, but with a clear focus on Steve and Bucky, who together connect the trilogy beyond the confines of the larger universe. Things do happen in between these movies, but Bucky only appeared in these 3, and if you focus just on Steve and Bucky, the trilogy works as one complete work. That being said, no solo movie benefits more from the large universe than Captain America Civil War. Building upon the years of friendship and conflict, Civil War does such a great job at focusing on the emotional aspect of the fracturing of the Avengers, while also not deviating from the fact that Captain America is in the title, and it's him who's the main character. Also, I mean, this shit is just so cool. There's a certain point with these movies where you just gotta sit back and enjoy how awesome the things that are happening are, and Captain America Civil War, it's definitely true for that. The Captain America trilogy blows the other 2 big 3 trilogies out of the water and was the best trilogy, not counting quadrilogies, in the MCU until very recently, dethroned, in my opinion, by Guardians of the Galaxy. With maybe a bit of influence from recency bias, it doesn't really matter because, like I said, these trilogies, in my opinion, are mostly equal in quality, but I think the Guardians trilogy, consisting of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, 2, and 3, and beginning in 2014 and now ending in 2023, is probably the strongest trilogy in the Marvel Cinematic Universe from start to finish. It's also the trilogy that took the longest amount of time to finally complete it, as it took 9 years. However, with the 4 appearances in between in movies and a holiday special, it didn't really feel that way. What it does feel like is a 100% complete story, and very thought out one as well, focused on a group of characters who go over the most incredible arcs in the MCU in 3 movies that are just the most consistent pure James Gunn goodness, with incredible visuals, cosmic world building, hilarity, tears, heart, and soul, made from a franchise that absolutely had no right to exist. The first movie, and at this point the entire trilogy, is one of the most impressive Marvel accomplishments, defying all expectations in its success, catapulting these Z-list characters from unknowns to household names. Starting with a movie that is hilarious, emotional, heartwarming, and a completely perfect balance of those things, plus a wonder of world building in the cosmic side of the Marvel Universe. And while the follow-up isn't regarded as being as good, I kind of disagree. I think Volume 2 is ever so slightly better than Volume 1, with better visuals, more interesting characterizations, a far better villain, and a higher peak in the emotional component. The first is probably more consistent, and the 2 movies are very close in quality, but I personally think Volume 2 is a very underrated part of an already beloved beloved trilogy. Volume 3, however, which I saw just a couple of days before making this video, takes all of those things to the next level in an insanely good movie that perfectly balances being one of the funniest, one of the most emotionally charged, simultaneously one of the most disturbing and yet heartwarming, and one of the most hype MCU movies, while also having some of the best action scenes in any MCU movie. I mean, that one hallway scene, probably the best fight scene that the MCU has ever produced. The Guardians trilogy is maybe the MCU's greatest triumph, rivaling the greatest comic book trilogies of all time, but unlike Spider-Man, Batman, Avengers, X-Men, and even Captain America, no one knew these characters at all, and yet, Guardians of the Galaxy Vol.3 managed to potentially be at the same level of hype that No Way Home reached, which is baffling. I mean, James Gunn literally made me cheer for Rocket Raccoon saying that he's Rocket Raccoon. I mean, that is impressive. Other comic book trilogies might technically be better, but Guardians of the Galaxy is probably the single most impressive comic book trilogy of all time, and a clear showcase of the creative genius that is James Gunn's vision, and let me tell you, the DCU is in great hands. Actually, I take that back. The Guardians movies are the second greatest MCU triumph. The first is exactly what you expect, the Avengers movies. They're just as impressive, if not maybe more. We've seen time and time again how studios try and fail to create a successful cinematic universe, and we've seen DC specifically try and fail to make a successful team-up movie with the Justice League movies, and while they did make a good one, it's a 4-hour director's cut of a movie that already existed, and it was released to streaming. Meanwhile, Marvel has been able to do this 4 times, 5 if you count Civil War, and that is truly impressive, consisting of the Avengers, Age of Ultron, Infinity War, and Endgame. Lasting from 2012 to 2019, the Avengers were the biggest movies in the world for the entirety of the 2010s. The first Avengers movie isn't very impressive by today's standards, but back in 2012, seeing 6 different heroes from across different movies teaming up against an alien invasion was the coolest thing ever, and cemented the MCU's place in movie history, and also, while it isn't exactly impressive for the MCU, like I said, for literally any other universe and studio, they still have not been able to do that. The Avengers is also just really good, great writing and character interactions, a fantastic villain, and great action. It isn't perfect, the cinematography does make it look like a TV show, but again, a hell of a lot better than anything any other studio has been able to do with a similar concept. Age of Ultron is definitely where the quadrilogy falters a bit, and it's the movie that forced me to rethink whether or not I will put this at number 1. However, I don't think it's bad enough to do that. It doesn't take itself seriously enough and forces in a bit too much setup for later, but not only did that setup pay off in spades, but also Age of Ultron is just a really fun movie with great action and character interactions. Like a much better Iron Man 2, it's an incredibly important movie to the structure of the universe, but not exactly fantastic on its own. However, it's more than made up for with Infinity War and Endgame, which are the 2 best movies in the MCU. Period. Infinity War is an insane achievement in the sheer amount of characters it brings together, and the creation of an absolutely iconic all-time movie villain who's reinvented from the comics in a way that blows any other version of the character out of the water. Infinity War is funny, action-packed, suspenseful, and genuinely scary, with an unmatched level of stakes to it that ended with the shocking of the entire world in the end with the snap. I thought there's no way they can top Infinity War, but then Endgame came out, an emotionally charged, epic conclusion to the MCU. Endgame pulled off something that most other franchises fail at, a satisfying ending, and doing it in a way that made for the single best theater experience of my life. The dread, the suspense, the intensity, the cheers, and the tears. Endgame remains the greatest film in the MCU, and the Avengers quadrilogy is probably the best comic book series of all time, as is the Infinity Saga of the MCU.